and I finally, this really gave me a lot of peace coming to this understanding of Genesis, and it maybe it will you too, I don't know, but we talked a lot about some different things. We talked a lot about what it's not and kind of how they viewed the world. We started talking a little bit about the actual text, and if you look at Genesis 1:1, it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water." And when you look at that, it was there, right? I mean, isn't that the Genesis 1:1, is that it was there? I mean, we talk about creation. We understand God created everything from nothing, but Genesis 1:1 isn't about that, and I think that's a point in a lot of ways I'm trying to make, is that we really, all my life, I've took this text and I've tried to make it explain science that it was never meant to explain. I haven't let it tell me what was God wanting us to get out of this. We talked a little bit a couple Sundays ago about this idea of created, this idea of bara in the Hebrew. It's what's in Psalms 51:10, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." This idea of create in me. That's the idea. Doesn't mean he wants you to rip the heart out, put a new heart in. It means he wants to put order or function to the heart that David has. And a lot of the idea of bara is the idea of functionality, the idea of making something work. It occurs about 50 times, and kind of recapping a little bit. Occurs about 50 times in the Old Testament. God's always a subject. It's always divine activity. It has to do with groups and phenomenon and people and abstractions, praise and purity. Never is really about the idea of what we would consider creating from nothing. It's more the idea of changing, moving. It's that type of thought. So a little bit different thought in that word than the idea of, creating from nothing. We talked about in the beginning of Genesis, that was formless and void, without function. There was no function to the earth. It was formless and void, and it was deep. All those ideas, darkness, depth, in the ancient world were all about chaos. It's tohu. It means it lacks worth or purpose. It's worthless. It has no value, in other words. That's the word in the Hebrew. It's without value. So, if you look at even Egyptian, Mesopotamian, you look at all these ancient religions, the idea of darkness, the idea of deep, the idea of water, all those things, sea, are chaotic. It's all elements of chaos. So when Moses was writing this, he was showing the world was chaotic. The world had no function, it had no form, it had no functionality. And the purpose of Genesis is not to say, how did God make it? The purpose of Genesis is more to say, how did God order that? And we'll talk a little bit about that. I brought up an engine, and we're going to talk about this same idea. I can have all the pieces of it there, but it doesn't work. It's not an engine. I mean, they can all be there. I can have everything. Everything can be made. Everything can be ready. Everything can be ready to be assembled, but it still has no form. It won't do what it's supposed to do in that state. Even though I have everything, it will not do what it's functioned to do. It will not perform the way it's supposed to. And I can put that together, and I can make an engine, right? But even that doesn't have function by itself. There's nothing it does. I have to put that in something. I have to put that in a vehicle. I have to give it a form. I have to give it functionality. So in the earth, that's what we have to have. We have to have order on this earth in order for us to survive, in order for us to live. We cannot live in a chaotic state. There's things that have to happen for me and you to exist upon this earth. We have to have weather, we have to have food, we have to have water, we have to have sunlight, we have to have gravity, we have to have all these different things in order for us to exist. Without that, we cease to exist as a people. We're going to cease to exist, right? Why did God call the light day? We talked about that a little bit. Why just call it light, right? But he called it day because God, this eternal God, one of the very first things he did was he created time. He said, we'll call the light day and the night. It's not a matter of creating it. We don't know that. There's nothing. Light isn't really a physical object. You don't walk into a sunbeam and bump your head, right? I mean, it's not really a physical object. It's more the idea that it's something that's there, that God put this together because God wanted us to have time. And in this, God gave us these things. And what do we talk about in our world? We talk about these three things, don't we? If you meet somebody at the bus stop or somebody on the street, what are you going to talk about, right? What time is it? You got a birthday, you got an anniversary. Boy, this weather's sure hot, right? What'd you have to eat today? That's what we talk about. Those things right there. The very first thing God created are the very most important things in our life. You might not think of that every day, but it is. Because if you really think about the conversations you have with the average person on the street, you're going to talk about these three things. It's just how it is. It's our life. It's what we do. We revolve around the clock. We revolve around weather, don't we? We look at our weather. I can't do this today, or it's going to be too hot, or it's going to be too wet, or it's going to be too windy, or right? Our world revolves around these things. What am I going to eat? Where are we going to go eat? What are we going to eat? We probably have less trouble with that than they did in the days of Moses, but we still think a lot about food, don't we? We still think about all of these things. So these people in the ancient world in Moses' time that Genesis was actually written to, these people didn't care about the manufactured material. They didn't care about that. They could care less. God made it. Good enough. They don't care. They don't have to know why. They don't have to know how. They have to know a date or a timeline. They didn't think the world was billions of years old, but why would they even consider that? It wasn't even in their book. They're not interested in that, are they? They're interested in function. And that's really what we should be interested in with God, because God is trying to tell them, expound to them, that this earth, this world, that I put this in place for you, that I ordered this world in order for you particularly to exist. That's why man becomes the culmination of creation on the sixth day, because everything God did, he put in place in order for man to survive, for man to exist, but that's not the climax of creation. You know, and that's something I hope we get to tonight. You know, man's not the climax of creation. I've heard that my whole life. You know, God said it was good. He made man. It was very good. We never talk about the seventh day. You know, the seventh day is the climax of creation, not the sixth day. And so we have to think about why. Why were there 7 days? What was the seventh day about? We need to consider that, right? Because in Genesis 8, this is after the flood. And I want you to look at what God did. God restored function after the flood. So the flood comes, the earth's all covered in water, right? And everything's destroyed. And Noah comes off the ark. And God makes a covenant with us. And that covenant is that until the end of time, I will never take away the functionality of the earth. Isn't that what he says? Food, right? Weather, and time. See that? The very first thing we looked at in Genesis. What's God do when Noah gets off the ark? He says, I'm going to restore the very things that I restored when I created the earth. Weather, food, and time. Those things aren't going to stop. And that's God's covenant. And do you see that? He says seed time and harvest, food, cold and heat, weather, summer and winter, weather, day and night, time, shall not cease. I'm going to put all that back into place. That's not going to cease until the end of time. What did God do? He restored the function of the earth. The earth was covered in water. Noah steps off the ark. God makes a covenant, says, guess what? I'm never going to make these things stop again. Until the end of time, you're going to have weather, you're going to have food, and you're going to have time. Till the end of time. I restored that. I've made a covenant. I'm never going to take that away from you. It's a really big thing when you kind of tie that together. So that's ontology is what we call it. It's a philosophy of existence. It's kind of a weird thing, I think. It's kind of a weird term, but you know, it's one of those things of how do we exist, right? Why do we exist? Well, you could say, you know, I exist, right? Therefore I am. Isn't that what the things say? You know, I'm here, therefore I am. But is that our existence? How do we quantify existence? We generally quantify our existence not by our fact that we take up space and breathe air. We quantify our existence by our function, right? What do you do? What did you accomplish? Have you ever went through a day and you go, well, I don't even exist. I didn't accomplish anything. At the end of the day, I didn't accomplish anything. I don't even exist. That's functional ontology. That's the idea that in order for me to exist, I have to produce something. I have to make something. So when we look at Genesis, we talk about this existence, we look at this two ways. We can say that we have a creation ontology, that Genesis is just about God creating from nothing, or it's a functional ontology, that God created this function of the earth. In the ancient functional ontology, existence is defined by function, not origin. They didn't think about origin. They thought about function. What, why? What does that do? How does it do it? What's the purpose of it? Genesis 1 provides an account of functional origins. not material origins. Remember in Genesis 1, it says the earth existed, it was formless and void, water, the Spirit moved across. God doesn't talk so much about material origin. He talks about functional origin. He separated the land from the water, right? He caused seeds to produce. Well, it didn't say he created it. He says he caused them to produce and to do these things. He did these things. Genesis 1 is about God bringing order out of disorder. So it's fruitless to ask what specific things God created on any given day, since the text is not concerned about the existence of matter or formational history. So that's where we mess up with Genesis. We want to make it a science text. We want to say, oh, well, this is how God did it. And that's what Ken Ham and Young Earth people, they want to do that with this Genesis text, but it leaves so many unanswered questions. So many things we just can't reconcile, right? We can't reconcile with science. We can't reconcile in our own mind. We struggle with that. What does it mean? How does it work? What did God do? So we got to get a little bit deeper into this, and I'm going to try to show you this. What's the climax of creation? You know, like I said, most of our lives we hear that it's day 6, right? Day 6, God created man. I've heard that my whole life. It was very good, right? He says God did this and it was good. God did this and it was good. We get to day 6, God created man and it was very good. But day 6 isn't the end of creation, right? Day 7 is the end of creation. The climax of creation is not man. The climax of creation is rest. And you know, that always astounded me. Because when I thought about that, I thought, does God need to rest? Did God do that in 7 days? I'm like, I'm just give out. Sit down in my chair, take a little break for a day, and then I'll get up and get back with it, right? Does God even care about time? Does God need rest? Did God get tired? Say, well, I've had enough. I'm just going to take a break. Why did he rest? What does rest mean? Well, to me and you, it doesn't mean a lot. To me and you, we look at rest and we think, well, just means you're tired, right? Worked for 6 days. We think about the Sabbath rest. He said, well, in 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th you shall rest. And we think about that. And then Jesus comes along and he says, was the Sabbath created for man or man for the Sabbath, right? In other words, why did God create that day of rest? Because we're tired, right? We've had a week, we're tired, we want to rest. Why did God rest? Was God tired? I don't think God was tired. I don't think God gets tired. So why did he do that? And why is that included? And why is it on the 7th day? And what does that have to do with all this? Well, I'm going to tell you. Temples. You know, we're not temple people. We don't have temples on every corner. When I was in Italy and Greece, there's temples on every corner in Italy and Greece. I mean, literally, there's temples on every corner. You can't walk around the block without hitting a temple. You know, you don't even know who most of them people are. There's gods I've never even heard of in my life. Can't even tell you their names, but they got a temple. You know, we went to Delos, and there's like 200 temples on Delos. I didn't even know there was that many gods. You know, it's crazy. You know, we've built these big temples, don't we? We build these temples. Build these temples in Greece and Athens. We build Hindu temples. That one on the left's the Hindu temple, Hindi temple. Big, magnificent buildings, magnificent structures. The Jews had a temple in Jerusalem, right? Had a temple, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Solomon made a temple. What's that? Why does that matter? You say, Rex, why does that matter? Because these are temple people. We're not temple people. We don't think about that. We don't think about what temples are, what temples represent. But temples were built so gods could do what? Rest. Temples are where gods rest. Temples are where gods go to rest. That's where they are. They're not there all the time. They build them that. They go there to rest. When God says, I rested on the 7th day, God made this a temple text, a sacred text. God made the earth sacred space. God said, God's rest is a temple. God's rest in temples. When God said, I'm going to rest, he means I'm going to rest. This is my temple. I've made this sacred space. I'm going to rest here. And so Genesis doesn't become a creation text. Genesis becomes a temple text. And when you think about this, and I'm going to show you kind of how this works, it starts to make a lot of sense. Because I never understood that 7th day of rest business. I never could figure that out. You know, God created the earth in 6 days, and on the 7th, he said, oh, I'm tired, I need to sit down. I don't think that works like that. Why is that culmination in this day of rest? When God said on the 7th day, God what? God rested. God is setting up a sacred space. If man is the climax of the 6 days, rest is the climax of the creation account. Right? we like to think we're the pinnacle of that thing. Man is the pinnacle of that, and maybe man is the pinnacle of the creation text. But rest is the climax of the whole thing. When you get right down to it, it's that seventh day that we have to think about. What does that seventh day have to do with Genesis? What's that day of rest have to do with Genesis? In Psalms 132, and look at this, I want you to look at what the psalmist says. He says, let us go into his dwelling place, let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, to your resting place, you and the ark of your strength. For the Lord has chosen Zion. Zion in the Bible is the city of God. The Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his habitation. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. The idea of God resting in what? Resting in a temple. God, we created the temple in Jerusalem. Why do we do that? God's rest in temples. God's presence was in the temple. When God rested on the seventh day, God was making this sacred space. He was making this as temple. And we're turning Genesis 1, we're taking it being a creation account into being a temple text about God creating this sacred space, creating this functionality, creating a world for us to live in. You and I look at this through 21st century, 20th, whatever, science. We want a scientific explanation. The people that Moses wrote Genesis to could care less about your science. They didn't care less about it. They didn't care anything about it. They didn't care if it took 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years, or 2 days. They care less. That wasn't what they wanted out of it. It's not what he was giving. It's not what God was telling them. What God was telling them is, I've established for you this sacred space. I've established for you a world that you can exist in, and I'm going to take care of you. And then when Noah got off the ark, what's the very first thing that he did? He said, I'm going to give you back that same thing. I'm going to give you back that functionality to this earth that I took away when it was flooded. If you look at the Hebrews text, what does it say? It says, look at this, and this is text you've probably read about, but you probably never read it in light of what I just told you. So look at what it says in Hebrews. For we who have believed enter that rest. Just as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world, for he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in the passage, they shall not enter my rest. Where's God's rest? Where does God rest? You know, the Hebrew writer says they won't enter. They haven't entered it. Why? They went into the promised land. Was that the rest? Is that what it was supposed to be? When they entered the promised land and crossed over the Jordan, was that God's rest? He says, no, they didn't enter it. He says, therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day today, saying through David, after so long a time, just as had been said before, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, crossing the Jordan, if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So what's the other day after that? What's the rest that we're waiting? You say, well, I know what that is, Rex. That's heaven. We're waiting to go to heaven. What's in heaven? What's in heaven? God's temple, God's throne. That's where God is, right? We're going to that rest. We're going to that other place. We're going to that temple. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, for God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fail, though following the same example of disobedience. You see what rest has to do with it? Why didn't they enter that rest? Because crossing the Jordan wasn't the rest, right? When you enter heaven, when you go to God's temple, when you go to where God is, you'll enter his rest. It doesn't say your rest. It doesn't say you're going to enter your rest. You're going to enter his rest, where he is, you see. If you look at Solomon's temple and you read that account, what goes on in Solomon's temple? So David starts, right? David wants to build the temple. You know that, 2 Samuel 7. David wants to build the temple. And so David basically goes to Nathan, I'm going to build the temple. Nathan comes back and says, no, you're not. And so David, he said, but your son will, right? Isn't that prophecy, 2 Samuel 7? Your son will build a house. So what's David do? David starts amassing huge amounts of timber and huge amounts of gold. If you read that account, he starts amassing all this stuff to build the temple, but he's not going to build it. And then Solomon comes along, and Solomon becomes king. And Solomon's supposed to build, but what does Solomon do? Solomon builds his house. Solomon builds his palace. Solomon does all that. Then Solomon finally decides, oh, well, I'll build God's house. So Solomon starts to build the temple. So for years, Solomon works on the temple. So all this stuff's prepared, all this material's prepared, all this stuff's done. Solomon finally gets all this stuff together, and Solomon builds the temple, and you can see it, and it's there, and you can touch it, and you can feel it, but it's not a temple. Because God's not there, right? It's not a temple, it's just a building. And Solomon's constructed this fabulous building, and yet it's just a building. And then what happens? In 7 days, Solomon dedicates it. You see this? Solomon delivered the feast at the time for 7 days, and all Israel with him. A very great assembly who came from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of Egypt. On the 8th day, they held a solemn assembly for the dedication of the altar they observed. If you read this whole account, what happens? For 7 days, they dedicate this temple, and then God's presence fills the temple, and his presence is there, and they see God's presence, and the temple becomes a temple because why? Because God stepped into it, because God's rest in temples. If you tie this back to what we just talked about in Genesis, what happens? You've got all this stuff there. You've got all this stuff that doesn't have order, doesn't have form. God comes in there. He functions, gives everything function. He gives everything form. He gives everything purpose. And then on the 7th day, the temple's dedicated. God rests. God comes into the temple, the sacred space, and Genesis becomes a temple text. That's a lot to wrap your head around, isn't it? First time I heard this, I had to go back and think about it about 450 times. But it really clears up a lot of things when you really start to think about it that way. So even though this temple was all there for years, they had been working on this for years. So how long did it take God to create? I don't have a clue. I don't care. I don't think he wants us to know, to be honest about it. I really don't think it matters. Because the point of Genesis 1 is not that God creates. We know that. I mean, how else did it happen, right? We know that. Hebrews said, we believe, right, that what was seen was created out of things that aren't seen. We know that. But is that what Genesis is about? I don't think so. Genesis is about function. It's about how God took a chaotic, dark, voidless blob, and God gave it time, God gave it food, God gave it weather, God gave it everything that we need to survive, and then God rested and entered it and said, now this is sacred space, and I'm going to walk with man, and man's going to be mine, and I'm going to be their God, and they're going to be my people. But now what's happened? God is where? God is in heaven. God's in Zion in heaven, and now the rest we look for is not here, can't be found here. The rest we look for is in heaven, and we haven't entered that rest, but we hope to enter that rest if we're obedient to what God wants us to do. You know, that analysis of the words, yes, it should be a 24-hour period, right? What's happening during these days? Most of the discussion is about the age of the earth. If the 7 days are like a temple inauguration, things are not necessarily being made in 7 days. In fact, the days are concerned with bringing order instead of making things that might have nothing to do with the age of the earth. To me, that makes a lot more sense. You know, all my childhood, all my life, I struggled with this idea. How does this work? How do you fit it together? How do you force science and force the Bible into this package? And you know, there was science on one hand yelling at people that believed in the Bible, and people in the Bible are over here yelling at people who have science, and they're all arguing about it. And the people over here are saying, oh, the earth's billions of years old, millions, billions of years old. And then we got all these other guys over here, young earth people and day age people, and all these other theories that we've come up with that are over here saying, oh, we can explain it, we can explain it. And at the end of the day, I think we're missing the whole point of Genesis. Because I don't think Genesis has anything to do with that. I think Genesis is about a God, Moses, writing to a people. Think about when he wrote this, right? He wrote this after he comes from the mount. The Israelites, Hebrew nations, just really became a Hebrew nation. He's writing to this group of people, and he's saying, listen, God has taken care of you. God's provided for you. God's ordered things for you to exist, and God will continue to do so until the end of time. Because that's the God that we serve. God created this for you, and then God rested in it, and it became his temple, his sacred space. And now, if you look at Hebrews, we're looking to go to heaven. That's the sacred space. That's where God rests. Zion, 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 the beautiful city of God. We sing that song, don't we? Why do we sing that song? Because that's where God is. That's where God rests. And that's where we desire to go. I'm going to talk about the creation of man a little bit next week and some other things, but I hope that kind of maybe, if you don't agree with me, it's okay. You don't have to. You can agree to disagree with me. I don't care. but I hope that it gives you a different perspective, a different way to look at Genesis. Exactly what God wanted to tell us. You know, so much of my life, the world has told me what I'm supposed to believe, and I've taken the Bible and I've tried to make the Bible fit what the world says I'm supposed to be. And I don't think that's how God intends us to take the Bible. I think he intends for us to take it for what it says, believe what it says, and to understand the comfort that God gives us through his word. And a lot of the comfort of Genesis to me is this idea that God cared enough about me and you to create a beautiful world that fits us perfectly for us to live in. You know, I don't need to know how God made atoms or molecules or sludge or slime or slugs or gnats or mosquitoes. I don't need to know any of that, right? I just need to know at the end of the day that God created a wonderful place for us to exist and gave us exactly what we need to live here and function and to prosper on this earth that he's created for us. And I think that's really what Genesis is about. Thanks for your time. If we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand.